So now that we've learned how to set data by using a one-way binding syntax to a particular property, we now need to learn how to get data. By get, I mean things such as user actions, such as a click of a button, typing with a keyboard, or anything that a user can perform with the UI. So what I'm going to do in this lesson is teach you the fundamentals of understanding how to bind an event. In the same way that in plain JavaScript, we might say element.addEventListener and then pass in something like click, submit, input, or change, we can do the exact same with Angular. Much like we bind a property that we want to talk to, we also bind the event that we want to talk to. What we're going to do is bind a click event. And if you haven't guessed already, you can see that we have a parentheses here. This then binds a click event or any event that we specify to our H1 element. We then can supply a callback inside of the quotation marks, much like we have done below with message. So here, all I'm going to do is set up a function called handleClick. We're then going to set up a function inside of our component. Now we don't need the constructor for this, so I'm going to blow that away. Now, one thing I like to do is have my ng on init at the top so I can see what's initialized when I open a particular component. And then further methods and declarations are then in the body further down in the function. So first things first, let's add a console log and we'll just say clicked. We'll save this out. We can go to our Chrome DevTools, open up our console. We can then click on our hello world and you can see clicked, and we can click this multiple times and see the number increment. There are a few things that we can obtain from this. We can ask for this event object, and you can see that we use this $event, and this is just the Angular way of asking for this special event object, which then gets given to us inside the function arguments. Now, because it's an event, it also has a corresponding type. So you can see that we have this event, which means if we get rid of our clicked, press save and log out our event, we then get a pointer event, which we can then expand, and we're back in the DOM world. You can see that we have things such as event.target, which then has properties such as inner HTML, inner text, and tons more properties that we can talk to. When we come to building forms, we're actually going to be using a slightly different approach, and we're not going to be binding things such as clicks and dealing with this $event directly. So this is one way when we come to build out custom functionality later on with Angular, we can talk directly to the DOM, but it's probable that there is in fact a better or a more Angular style that we can adopt instead of dealing with this event object directly. That said, it's completely up to you. If you want to use this event object, it is there for you if you'd like. So with this in mind, let's bind an event to our input because that's probably going to be a bit more interesting. So an input can have many events. You can see that we have a lot of events that we can bind. We could bind the change event, which is then going to fire every time we type something and then leave the input. However, we also have an input event of all names, which is essentially going to fire an event every single keystroke from the user, which is nice because we can then start to reflect those values or use those values elsewhere. Perhaps we are making a search, and when that length becomes 5, we can then send a request off to the back end, perform some validation, and these are things that we're going to learn throughout the course as well. So we're binding an input event. We're then going to have a handle input function. Much like above, we're going to pass in our event object, and we can take this handle input definition, jump down into the body of our component, pass in this event of type event. And this is a common practice in TypeScript, is to make sure that you are typing all of your arguments that we're actually going to be using. So if we go ahead and say console.log event, save this out, go into our input and start typing, you can see that we have this input event. Now at the moment we are generically typing using this event, and we did actually have a pointer event with our handle click. So it's up to you if you want to use the more specific one. If the event object gives you everything you need to correctly type it, then go ahead and just use that. Otherwise, we can be more specific because, for example, if we say event.target, this is then going to give us the element itself, as you can see. If we then decide that we want to obtain the value, we can do something like event.target.value. However, if we hit save, we then see this failed to compile. Property value does not exist on type event target. So what's happening here? we need to use a TypeScript feature called type casting. And I'm just teaching you some very basic TypeScript just to help you on your way. But essentially what we want to do is make sure that these properties that we are accessing are strictly available to us when we're actually using them. Otherwise, we're going to see some errors. So that is the benefit of using TypeScript. What this means is we can obtain our value by referencing our event.target. Now, what we could do instead of doing .value here, use some destructuring. So we can pull that property out, which is then going to give us the same error. So value is declared but never used, but we have this does not exist on type event target, which means that we could go ahead and remove this, and we are essentially left in the same place. So those two lines of code are essentially equivalent. We're trying to access that value from our event target. So this is the point where after we have accessed our event, we want to then tell TypeScript that this is in fact an HTML input element. This event target, I want to type it as the HTML input element. And this might look quite strange if you've not used TypeScript before, but what this is essentially doing is a type casting. We're casting our event target and telling the TypeScript compiler that we are strictly using this HTML input element, which means that when we hit save, we then see a compile success. We can then start adding some characters, and down below you can see that on every single keystroke, we then see the changes. Now, this may be a bit more advanced than a typical introduction to Angular's event binding. However, I want to give you the best knowledge that I possibly can and cover things that you will encounter, I am very sure, in the future when building Angular applications, especially with TypeScript and how popular it is. Now, as I have already mentioned before, using this event isn't a very common use case for us when obtaining values from a form. I just want to demonstrate this to you. If you need to, in the future, build some very specific form functionality, then you will need to know this stuff. However, when we start to build Angular forms, they perform all of this logic under the hood for us. So in fact, it makes our lives far easier. We don't have to deal with events and typecasting. We can just simply get given a value. And this is something that we'll come onto in the forms chapter. However, this is how to deal with raw events. One thing I'd also mention is when we come to component communication, the way that we pass data is via property bindings, and the way that we get data from a component is via an event binding. So that's just a small heads up of what's coming, and essentially allows us to pass data between components is using these one-way data binding principles of property binding and event binding. What I'm going to do is change our interpolation above to the new message. What this then allows us to do, or will allow us to do, on our handle input, we're then going to take the value that's passed in here and then reassign it. So what this allows us to do is then set another value. So we can say new message, and we can set that to a value of string. Now, instead of setting this inside of our ng on the init, we can totally ignore our handle click. Because we're getting the value down here, we can say this dot new message equals that value. So that means that we can save this out. You can see at the moment that nothing is in fact rendered above because new message is completely empty. However, once we start typing, you can see that our hello world is then changing upon every single keystroke. So this is essentially a correct way to implement one-way data flow. We take the data of message, we then want to change it, so we then grab the new change event, we then set it to a new variable. So this process of grabbing the data every single time is something that we're going to encounter. We could in fact completely change this .message over. So for example, we could change this to message, we could then start typing, but you see that this does not update because this is essentially a one-way binding syntax. We're just rendering that message once. If we want to then reflect the changes, we need to then update that particular property. We could, of course, go down into our component and we could say this .message equals the value, and then every single time it would update. However, what this is doing is mutating our initial state value. So by doing this, I'm trying to kick you of the habit before we get going of mutating values as soon as you are given them. What we want to essentially do is take a copy of those values and then reflect those changes. And this will make much more sense when we start to build out some real component architecture and deal with some component communication. So in this lesson, we've looked at the event binding syntax. We've talked about $event. We've looked at various input events, such as this input here. We've then looked at some type definitions and how we can update a particular value and then reflect it elsewhere. And I want to mention actually, one of the benefits of not mutating that original value is we could in fact have a button such as reset, and we could click that button and then we could set the text back to its original state. So this is just another reason why we should adopt this kind of pattern. This might seem a lot of manual work when we come to building our components and dealing with forms. Much of this is done for us behind the scenes. So I'm kind of teaching you this bare basics and the thought process behind it. And as we continue through the course, things will start to really unfold. So that's it for this lesson. We've looked at the event binding syntax and talked about various different ideas. We've also talked about when we are going to start building our custom components, how to get data out of them. For example, if a user hits submit in a particular form, we will use this event syntax to get that value from a component. So that's it for this lesson. Let's dive into the next one, where we're going to talk about template reference variables.